behind the lines. Civil War medicine. Medical practices, the lack of sanitation, instruments for operating were just wiped off on the smock or shirt sleeve, and the doctor would use it for the next patient. The spread of diseases exacerbated problems of the soldiers during the war. Only about 60% of those were killed in combat died while fighting. The other 40% died later from their wounds. Prisoner of war camps, especially, were breeding grounds for infection. Women in the war. More than 100,000 Northern women worked in various industries during the war. Women also worked in the expanding government bureaucracy and also as nurses. In the North, about 20,000 women served as nurses or health-related volunteers during the war. On both sides, the departure of so many men required women to take part in spheres usually dominated by men. Claire Barton oversaw the distribution of medicines to Union troops. She later helped found the American Red Cross, of which she remained president until the age of 83. Susan King Taylor was born into slavery, and she served as a nurse in the Union-occupied Georgia and operated a school for free slaves. Dorothy Dix was a superintendent for Army nurses for no pay, and Mary Ann Bickerdike, the woman you see pictured there, was a no-nonsense and very efficient. Soldiers called her Mother Bickerdike. She was very authoritative, and General Sherman would say, "She ranks me." General Grant would say to an army surgeon who incurred her displeasure, "My God, man, Mother Bickerdike outranks everyone, including Lincoln." Widows. But the war left also thousands of women widowed and devastated. The new economic opportunities created by the war did open up women's options, including admissions to higher education. Southern women and the war. Southern women managed plantations, worked in the fields alongside slaves. They also worked in factories making uniforms and munitions, government offices, and they taught school. As the war continued, many women helped their deserting husbands and relatives elude the Confederate authorities. By 1864, many Southern women had grown tired of the war. Wartime government. To boost the economy, Congress passed a series of acts, beginning with the Morrill Tariff of 1862, which raised revenue through tariffs and protected U.S. manufacturing. The Pacific Railway Act provided funding and land grants that led to the building of the nation's first transcontinental railroad that connected the nation's pre-existing railroad infrastructure in Omaha, Nebraska, and crossed the continent to Sacramento, California. The Homestead Act granted 160 acres of free public land to settlers if they lived on the land for 5 years and improved on it. It also led to the creation of the Department of Agriculture to help farmers pursue productive agricultural practices. The Morrill Land Grant College Act was also passed by Congress in July of 1862, awarding proceeds from the sales of public land to the states for establishment of agricultural and mechanical, later engineering colleges. The National Banking Act of 1863 created national banks whose paper currency could be used nationwide, the first nationwide currency. Union finances. In order to finance the war, the Union taxed, borrowed, and printed more money in 1862. Congress created the Internal Revenue Service and passed the first ever income tax on both citizens and corporations. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 authorized the issuance by the Treasury Department of $450 million greenbacks printed with green ink, or paper currency. In addition, the government raised revenue through bond sales, new industries, and productivity. And after an initial downturn before the war, the northern economy picked up quickly, and new industries boomed, and new inventions increased manufacturing efficiency. The productivity of northern agriculture grew as well, fueled by the emergence of farm machinery. Through wages increased during the war, prices rose higher, reviving the trade union movement. And by 1865, 200,000 northern workers belonged to unions. The prospect of large profits bred greed and corruption, and profiteers traded with the enemy, swindled the government, and sold shoddy, which were bad goods to the army. The Northern economy, however, fed, clothed, and armed the Union soldiers, as well as keeping most civilians employed and well fed. Union politics and civil liberties. After the Southern states announced their secession from the Union, most of their congressmen joined the Confederate government. This left a Republican majority in Congress with a Republican president and allowed the party to pursue many other economic policies. Lincoln used executive authority to silence opposition through several controversial actions, unconstitutional actions, including the suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Executive sanctions fell hard on dissenting Democrats called Copperheads, and radical Republicans led by Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, who had now recovered from his wounds, a group of shifting Republican congressmen, usually a substantial minority, who favored the abolition of slavery from the beginning of the war and later advocated harsh treatment of the defeated South. The Copperheads was a term Republicans applied to Northern Democrat war dissenters and those suspecting of aiding the Confederate cause during the war. The Habeas Corpus Act of 1863 compelled Lincoln to arrest over 14,000 people, and in one instance, he banished one to the Confederacy. The Copperhead Democrats, of course, sought peace, even if it meant recognizing the Confederacy. The overall Democratic Party favored fighting the war, however, reluctantly, and backed Lincoln's war policy, even though they often disagreed with the Republican Party or Lincoln's economic policy. Certain war Democrats, such as Tennessee Senator Andrew Johnson and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, were more than openly open to Lincoln's policies. Southern politics. In the Confederacy, the executive branch enjoyed a 6-year term, so neither Jefferson Davis nor his Vice President Alexander Stephens had to run again during the course of the war. Davis's biggest challenge came from those arch secessionists who, once their state had left the Union, refused to give much support to the new Confederate government. Southern politics was also hindered by dissent that grew stronger as the Confederacy fortunes declined. States' rights was a major obstacle to the development of central authority. Because there were no political parties, Davis could not appeal to party loyalty to control dissent. There was calls for peace that arose as early as 1863. And attempts by Davis and other Confederate leaders to build a strong sense of Confederate nationalism would fail. The Southern economy. Difficulty in feeding its population, bread riots broke out in Mobile, Atlanta, and Richmond. As the war progressed, Southern soldiers had threadbare uniforms, with many garments and arms taken from the Union. Their families suffered under similar conditions. The Union and Confederate armies threatened civilians with robbery, rape, and murder, and many slaves stopped working and abandoned the plantations altogether. The faltering Confederacy, the Confederate high water mark. The Battle of Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville is just west of Fredericksburg. On May 2nd to the 4th, with 130,000 men at his disposal, Joseph Hooker boasts that what he would do to Robert E. Lee's 130,000 to 60,000. Hooker, to try to get to Lee's rear at Fredericksburg, was his plan. Stuart's cavalry revealed the Union movements, and Lee would order Major General Richard H. Anderson's division under Longstreet to march west and construct fighting positions. Lee then moved the rest of his army, with the exception of Major General Jubal Early's 10,000, to remain at Marye's Heights to contain Sedgwick at Fredericksburg. The plan, to divide and conquer. The Federal line stretched from the Rappahannock, the center at Chancellorsville, and the right flank drawn back to the Wilderness, with Howard's corps facing south. Stuart reported to Lee that the Union right flank was in the air, meaning it was vulnerable. Lee and Jackson are going to devise one of the most audacious moves in the history of modern warfare. Lee would hold his Federal Army in position facing Hooker. Jackson then would march his entire corps of 26,000 to attack Howard's open flank, leaving only 17,000 to face Hooker's 73,000. On May 2nd, Jackson moved out from an obscure furnace trail in the wilderness, and they emerged from the Brock Road and followed the Orange Turnpike near the Wilderness Tavern. Federal pickets nervously reported a large army is moving. Hooker thought it was a retreat and sent Dan Sickles in pursuit. General Dan Sickles would be stopped by Jackson's rear guard. Jackson's rebels were falling behind and drove two Union divisions down the turnpike past Hooker's headquarters at Chancellorsville. What was not shown in the video, if you saw it, was that deer came bounding out of the woods, and the Union soldiers were like, "Where in the heck why are these deer running towards us?" And that's when they saw the Confederate attack. When darkness fell, the Confederates stopped, and Jackson decided, well, maybe I should go forward and try to see if there could be a possible night attack, something that was rare in the war, while his soldiers were exhausted and disorganized. Jackson would go on the reconnaissance to scout the Union position for a possible night attack. When he came back to the Confederate lines, he was shot by a picket. Command would then pass to A.P. Hill, who would be wounded, and command passed to Stuart. When Robert E. Lee heard what had happened to Jackson, he said, "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." The battle that took place in May 3rd and 6th. Stuart took Hazel Grove, and Nolan set up an artillery, and Hooker at Chancellorsville was apprehension over the course of the battle. Hooker was dazed when a cannonball from Hazel's Grove hit a pillar he was leaning against, but he refused to relinquish command. He finally ordered for his withdrawal of his army to a new defensive position to the rear of Chancellorsville. Sedgwick would attack early at Fredericksburg in the morning and drove them off their position. And Major General Lafayette McCall's of Longstreet's corps halted Sedgwick at Salem Church. Lee had anticipated that Hooker would remain passive and attack the interior lines at separate turns. Stuart would contain Hooker in a concentration assault on Sedgwick's isolated force. Sedgwick fought a skillful delaying battle and escaped across the river at night. Lee looked to attack Hooker in force on the 6th of May, but Hooker had now withdrawn. In the aftermath and casualties, the Union suffered 17,000 casualties, the Confederates 13,000. The Battle of Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee realized that General Jackson's death would be a terrible loss for the South. The South won the battle, but suffered a high cost in lives, and was among Robert E. Lee's most stunning victories in 1863. A move west. Davis and his advisors were thinking up a way to change the strategic balance in the West, shift troops from Lee, perhaps a whole corps, to the West. General Johnston approved. Even Lee, in the early March, had hoped if Virginia could take a turn, he'd be in favor of it as well. General Beauregard was in command of the Department of South Carolina and Georgia, and believed that a decisive victory over Rosecrans in Tennessee would force Grant to withdraw or face being destroyed. Secretary of War Seddon favored a transfer of troops, as well did General Longstreet. Chancellorsville changed that as it did Lee's mind. With Hooker's powerful army in front of Lee, it would be too risky. Reinforce the armies in Mississippi and Tennessee from the lower Atlantic coast, which were doing nothing. Vicksburg, early maneuvers. In the Western Hemisphere, Grant was trying to secure the city of Vicksburg, which occupied a strategic bend in the Mississippi River. By capturing it, he had cut the South in half, for whoever controlled Vicksburg controlled the river. Lincoln called it the key, and he wanted the key in his pocket. He launched a daring overland campaign against the city and placed it under the siege. Rear Admiral David Porter's gunboats and transports ran past the batteries at Vicksburg and landed 40 miles south of it. Sherman's Corps fought against Confederate defenses at Chickasaw Bluffs, and Union cavalry under Colonel Benjamin H. Garrison created confusion by raiding Mississippi to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. McClernand and McPherson, Grant sent two corps under Major General McClernand and Major General James B. McPherson down the west bank, marching through swamps to the rendezvous with Porter. This is what you see from the squiggly line here. On April 30th to May 6th, Grant ferried his army to the east bank. His men believed in Grant. Quite often on the march, they would be moving along the road or over a bridge, and right beside them would be General Grant on his horse, a dust-covered man on a dust-covered horse saying, "Move on close up." So they felt very much that he was personally in charge of the movement, and it gave them added confidence, according to Shelby Foote. So Grant's army is right here that you can see in the map. All right. The goal is Pittsburgh. Grant is basically cut off. Now let's see, what will the Confederates do? General Johnston would wire Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton in Vicksburg, imploring him to unite his whole force and strike at Grant, who was now cut off and outnumbered 50,000 to 41,000. To do it, Pemberton would have to temporarily abandon Vicksburg to strike at Grant. But on May 9th, Jefferson Davis ordered Johnston to go to the Mississippi and take charge of the situation. Davis wired Pemberton telling him that Grant would have to stay near his base, the fleet, and hold Vicksburg and Port Hudson to preserve the Confederate line of communication. Pemberton took this as an order, so he stayed put. So he disobeyed Johnston's order. Meanwhile, Grant began to move out. And in 3 weeks, Grant's army, cut off from all communication from the outside world, marched 180 miles, fought and won 5 battles at Port Gibson, Raymond on May the 12th. And then Johnston arrived and took command of 6,000 Confederates there. The next day, Grant took Jackson. Grant then took Champion's Hill and Big Black River. Vicksburg was now surrounded. After 6 weeks' bombardment, General John C. Pemberton will surrender, 30,000 plus troops, on July 4th, 1863. After the news of the fall of Vicksburg, Confederate forces at Port Hudson, Louisiana, surrendered on July the 9th, leaving the Mississippi River entirely in the Union control and splitting the Confederacy in half. The casualties between October and July were 9,000 Union and 10,000 Confederate, not counting prisoners. Meanwhile, back in the East, Secretary of War Seddon applied to Lee to send a division to reinforce Mississippi. Longstreet believed a detachment should be sent to Tennessee to strengthen Bragg. Lee disagreed. The distance was, one, too far, and the Army of Northern Virginia would be weak and would have to withdraw to Richmond and not be a strategic threat. On May 15th, Lee, Seddon, and Davis held a meeting conventionally arguing to invade the North. Strengthen the Peace Democrats and foraging for his army in Pennsylvania would feed them and give respite to the farmlands in Virginia. Seddon withdrew his proposal, and the cabinet agreed with Lee. Students of war have criticized Lee for being myopic and not looking at the big picture. Even Lee had said in the previous year, if the Mississippi Valley is lost, the Atlantic states will be ruined. So Grant was threatening Vicksburg, ready for a siege. Bragg and Rosecrans were a stalemate in Middle Tennessee. Lee had the advantage of recent victory at Chancellorsville, high morale. he seemed to be invincible, and he seized the initiative. All three campaigns will end up deciding the war, and they knew it. The Battle of Gettysburg. On June 4th, 1863, advance units of the Army of Northern Virginia began their march to the Potomac, a few miles above Harper's Ferry. Drawing the Union Army out of Virginia and Tennessee, take pressure off Virginia farms during the growing season, especially the bread basket of the Confederacy, the Shenandoah Valley, and to recall the Union Army out of Tennessee, Vicksburg, or both, and thus relieve pressure there. The political hope, additionally, any victories won on Northern soil would put political pressure on Abraham Lincoln's administration to negotiate a settlement to the war, or might lead to the South's long hoped for military alliance with Great Britain and France. As he wrote the Secretary of War that he hoped to take the enemy force at a disadvantage, defeat, and virtually destroy it to end the war, Confederate General Robert E. Lee decided to take the war to the enemy. On June 13th, he defeated Union forces at Winchester and then continued north to Pennsylvania. General Hooker, who had been planning to attack Richmond, was instead forced to follow Lee. Hooker never was comfortable with his commander, and General Halleck resigned on June the 28th, and General George Meade replaced him as commander of the Army of the Potomac. When Lee heard that Meade, an old friend of his from the Army, was the commander, he says, "I cannot make a mistake, or George Meade will act on it." The Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, 1863, the first day. On the morning of July 1st, Major General Henry Heath of A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps sent his 7,500 men division down the Chambersburg Pike towards Gettysburg. There was a belief that the town had shoes. First, they encountered resistance, which they initially assumed was just more of hastily assembled Pennsylvania emergency militia that had been skirmishing during the campaign. In reality, it was General John Buford who had deployed part of 2 brigades of Union cavalry as skirmishers on the brush of Willoughby's Run, 3 miles west of town. Now, looking at this map that we see here on the first day, what is important to note is that here we see A.P. Hill and Ewell's troops, and they're going to push Union cavalry back to right here to Cemetery Hill. Okay? Now, what's important to understand is if you remember Antietam, they found Lee's written orders. After that, Lee would not give any written orders. So he would say, basically, you take that hill if practical. Okay? So here we are back at the first day of the battle. So, moving cautiously, Meade had planned to make a defensive position along the Pipe Creek in Maryland. And just 2 weeks previously, they had been issued breech-loading carbines, which they used the gun's fast-loading capability to create the impression that they were facing a much larger force than what they actually did. Lee informed Longstreet that afternoon of his intention to renew the attack on the following day. Longstreet is going to object, basically because he thought the whole time the reason they were fighting this war was going to be a defensive war. He opposed the movement to Pennsylvania initially. He believed what they should do is disengage, move around to the south flank of the enemy as to interpose its force between the Union and Washington, thereby forcing Meade to have to attack on their ground. Lee would say, if Meade is there tomorrow, I will attack him. Longstreet told Lee, if Meade is there, he wants you to attack him. Lee would meet Ewell late in the afternoon and ordered him to attack the Union flank the next morning. Ewell's response was in the comments of his division commanders, and Early and Robert E. Rhodes were so lacking that Lee changed his mind to use Longstreet's corps to attack the southern end of the Union line. Ironic indeed. The fighting on the second day opened with a Confederate artillery barrage. An hour later, Hood's rebel division swept in and around the Union flank, overran the Devil's Den, and began to climb up the undefended Little Round Tops. The Little Round Tops would dominate the entire Federal position. Warren would send troops to the crest and repulse Hood's troops after a bitter struggle. One message found its way to Strong Vincent, commanding the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division of the Federals' 5th Corps. He double-timed his men and deployed them among the rocks and the trees of the Little Round Top, the western and southern slopes. The fate of the Union Army at this moment rested on the shoulders of 1,350 men of the 83rd Pennsylvania, 44th New York, the 16th Michigan, and at the very far end, the 20th Maine Regiment. Vincent's orders were hold this ground at all cost. Nearly 650 rebels of the 15th Alabama would storm to the saddle between the Round Tops around 6 p.m. and into the muzzles of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine. After an hour of intense fighting, Chamberlain's 300-plus men had nearly exhausted their 15,000 rounds of ammunition. He ordered a countercharge to fix bayonets. The surprised Alabamians had fallen back and attempted to make a stand, but Company B of the 20th Maine, which had been detached earlier to cover the regiment's flank, and 14 Huron-burdened sharpshooters rose from behind a stone wall and charged the Confederate flank. Convinced that they were outnumbered, the men of the 15th and 47th Alabama retreated to one of the Round Tops. On the western slope, Colonel Vincent's other regiments also stirred firm until part of the 16th Michigan pushed back and Governor Warren, receiving a plea for reinforcements, ordered the 140th New York Zouaves to charge, and they broke the rebels' long line enough for Warren reinforcements to arrive. By the time the sun went down on the second day of Gettysburg, the Union left still held, but 3rd Corps would no longer be a significant factor in the battle, and 5th Corps had been badly mauled. Meanwhile, a desperate contest was taking place on the slope of Cemetery Hill. Gettysburg, July 3rd. Much to Longstreet's surprise, he was tapped by Lee to direct the combined operation, even though Hill had at least as many men committed to the assault. Speaking with a bluntness that perhaps he would recuse himself once and for all, Longstreet said, "General, I have been a soldier all my life. I've been with the soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know as well as anyone what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position." Nonetheless, Hill's poor handling of troops on July 1st was still fresh in Lee's mind, so Longstreet got the assignment. Despite the passionate arguments of Longstreet, Lee instructed his old warhorse to strike the Union center on Cemetery Ridge, using the division of Brigadier General Johnson's Pettigrew and Major General Isaac Ridgway Trimble, and the recently arrived division of Major General George Pickett. In all, approximately 15,000 men were to advance 3/4 of a mile across open ground, climb fences across the road, and charge up a gradual but steep slope of Cemetery Ridge to assail a force about 6,500, but the Federals had reinforcements close by. Pickett's charge. Before 3 p.m. on a bright, hot summer day, from Cemetery Ridge, the Army was aimed to point on the Cemetery Ridge shortly south of Cemetery Hill, marked by a small copse of trees. Pickett would inspire his men by shouting, "Up, men, and to your post! Don't forget today that you're from old Virginia." The charge. Pettigrew's division of 4 brigades formed the left of the attack line, and 2 of Thimbl's brigades behind them and to the right for support. Pickett's men stepped out onto the right. The advance was disordered by terrain and by flanking fire on Pettigrew's left. As it neared the Union line, Pickett's advance drifted left, exposing his right to enemy fire. Throughout shot, shell, and canister and rifle fire, the long Confederate line surged forward. General Winfield Scott Hancock would command Cemetery Ridge. This would prove to be the high water mark of the Confederacy. Armistead's brigade made the farthest progress near the Union center. It broke through temporary unit reinforcements and drove it back, but Armistead was mortally wounded, falling near the angle at what is now known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Neither of the other two divisions made comparable progress across the field. Armistead's success was not reinforced, and his men were quickly killed or captured. It was a bloodbath. Pickett's charge cost the Union about 1,500 killed and wounded. The Confederate casualties were several times that. Over 50% of the men that went across the field ended up either dead or wounded. Pickett's three brigade commanders, Kemper was wounded in action, Garnett and Armistead killed in action, and all 13 of his regimental commanders were casualties. Trimble and Pettigrew were the most senior casualties, the former losing a leg and the latter wounded in the hand and later mortally wounded during their retreat to Virginia. The effects. The North suffered 23,049 casualties, the Confederates 28,063 casualties. That's not the number dead. That includes dead, wounded, and missing. Lee began to withdraw into Virginia on July 4th. Rains prevented a rapid withdrawal and for 2 days at the Potomac River, but Meade failed to pursue Lee, giving Lee time to return to Southern soil. The Gettysburg Address. In November of 1863, Lincoln would give a speech that didn't last more than 2 minutes for the dedication of the National Cemetery. The speech did help Americans realize that the United States is a single nation, not a collection of states. 70 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and the dedication of the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met here on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note or long remember what we say here, but can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they have, thus far, so nobly carried on. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that this government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Battle of Chattanooga. Bragg did not have enough to take the city of Chattanooga. Only a trickle of supplies could reinforce the army. Major General Joseph Wheeler would capture 500 supply wagons, and Lincoln ordered Hooker and 17,000 to move to Bridgeport. Grant was given command, and privately Lincoln told John Hay that Rosecrans seemed confused and stuffed like a duck hit on the head. Grant replaced Rosecrans with Thomas and ordered him to hold. We will hold the town until we starve. Grant was able to drive the Confederates from Brown's Ferry and then construct pontoon bridges across the river and open up new supply lines. Grant ordered Sherman from Mississippi with an additional 20,000. General Longstreet was frustrated due to the fact that the Confederate command was not trying to block the only access to Chattanooga. Corps commanders were calling for Bragg's removal. Longstreet was asking for Lee to give command, since they needed to be on the offensive. But Davis, after hearing the criticism of Bragg, left him in command and removed Polk to Mississippi, and D.H. Hill was left with no command. Longstreet and 15,000 were ordered to try to retake Knoxville. The Union Army now had 70,000 and concentrated under the three of their most capable generals, and the Confederates under one of the weakest. On November 23rd, Thomas took Orchard Knob. On November 24th, Hooker accomplished the first part of his mission, tried the Confederates holding the position between Lookout Mountain and the river. In the Battle of the Clouds that night, a detachment from Hooker's took Lookout Mountain from a handful of Confederates and planted the United States flag. Sherman assaulted the Confederate right of Hardee's corps, but could not break through. Hooker on the Confederate left was moving slow. Thomas in the center seized the Confederate line of rifle pits under Breckinridge's corps at the base of Missionary Ridge and charged up the slope without orders. If the assault failed, Grant said someone would have to pay for the blunder. The Confederates were demoralized, and in their lack of faith, their commander fled what would be called the miracle of Missionary Ridge. The casualties for the U.S. Army amounted to 5,824. 753 of them were killed. Of the 56,000 engaged, Bragg reported Confederate casualties at 6,667. 361 of them were killed. 4,000 were missing, mostly prisoners, out of about 44,000. Southern losses may have been higher, and Grant claimed 6,142 prisoners. When a chaplain asked General Thomas, whether the dead should be sorted and buried by state, Thomas replied, "Mix 'em up. I'm tired of states' rights." The Union was now poised to dissect the upper and lower South. Grant comes east. A state that is often forgotten in the study of the Civil War is our own home state of Florida. Union forces or purpose was trying to take Tallahassee. Tallahassee and Austin in Texas were the only two capitals never to be captured by the Union Army during the course of the war. The purpose was to cut Florida out from the rest of the Confederacy. Florida, in its importance, was able to basically feed the South. At the Battle of Olustee, the rebel forces would defeat the Union Army on February 24, 1864. By percentage, the Olustee battle was the bloodiest battle of the entire war. And as I said before, their capital was not able to fall. If the Union had defeated the Confederates at Olustee in 1864 and moved across and taken Tallahassee, the war would have ended very quickly as the South was losing out with food. The Fort Pillow Massacre. On April 12, 1864, the battle was fought at Fort Pillow on the Mississippi River in Hennig, Tennessee. After the surrender of 300 Union soldiers, mostly African Americans, the Confederate troops under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who later would form the Ku Klux Klan, murdered them instead of taking them as prisoners of war. News of this bloodbath, known as the Fort Pillow Massacre, spread across the nation and led to further brutality on both sides. It still remains unclear even today whether Forrest ordered the massacre, encouraged it, ignored it, or as he later claimed, was unaware of that. Ulysses S. Grant was appointed commander of all Union forces. George Meade would remain the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Grant's plan called for a war of attrition, where he would coordinate the Union effort and change the tempo of the war. The strategy had changed from trying to take Richmond, which was always at the goal of the beginning of the war, to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. Very simple. You destroy Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, you destroy the Confederacy. Grant's strategy was to hammer the enemy continuously. Sherman was advancing through Georgia, and Grant's major focus was to go after Lee in Virginia. The Overland Campaign. Grant found out that his officers had a spirit of apprehension and admiration for Lee. Graf's staff, who praised Grant and his exploits in the West, were met with, well, Grant's never met Bobby Lee yet. Grant ordered Meade, wherever Lee goes, you will go also. Burnside was brought from Tennessee, bringing the numbers of the Army of the Potomac to 120,000. Longstreet would join Lee and return, bringing the Army of Northern Virginia to 65,000, spread from Fredericksburg to Gordonsville. Grant's plan would be constantly move to Lee by the left flank. Means you attack, then move your forces to the left, attack, move your forces to the left. The Battle of the Wilderness. Grant's plan was to cross the Rapidan and into the wilderness from the Chancellor's battlefield and outflank Lee and draw him out in open battle. Major General Franz Sigel was to march into the Shenandoah Valley, Lee's source of rations. Major General Benjamin Butler, with the Army of the James, was to move from the James River and threaten Richmond and join the Army of the Potomac. Lee would send Ewell and A.P. Hill's corps into the wilderness, where it would be difficult for Grant to maneuver. Longstreet would be held in reserve. On May 5th, the battle would start, and Confederate General Ewell engaged Major General Governor K. Warren's corps. A.P. Hill fought off Hancock's corps, and the battle was a standoff. The battle on May 6, the Union generals Irwin Sedgwick and Hancock attacked Ewell, but he held. Due to A.P. Hill was facing defeat, Lee ordered Longstreet to attack. Lee would rally his troops by riding to the front himself under fire, and his own men would tell him, "Go back, General Lee, go back." The result is that fire had erupted in exploding shells and actually burned men alive that were wounded. The Union casualties was 18,000. Confederates was 10,800. But instead of falling back and reorganizing, Grant ordered the Army to move to the left flank along Brock Road. This shocked and surprised the Union Army. They're used to, after getting beat by Bobby Lee, you go back and regroup and wait a couple of weeks, maybe months. Warren and Sedgwick would then move out. Hancock's corps penetrated the Muleshoe. That's kind of hard to say. The Muleshoe is located right here where that arrow is going, at the apex that was held by Ewell. The Bloody Angle, as it was known, and Major General Horatio G. Wright would hit the west side of the Lambda and the Burnside on the east. So you have attacking on this side and attacking on that side. A desperate countercharge by Gordon and Robert E. Lee resealed the line. The aftermath, the battle would only be a slugfest until the 20th. Grant, who had originally planned to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer, began another march to the left flank heading south for Hanover Junction. The casualties were 18,000 for the Union, 12,000 for the Confederate. Lee once again anticipated Grant and deployed his army in Northern Virginia in another Lambda formation south of the North Anna River. Grant, seeing the strength of Lee's defense, would not engage and move again. On May 31st, Grant found Lee, again this time at Cold Harbor, and assumed that Lee was thin and ripe for a frontal assault. Before the Battle of Cold Harbor, during the Spotsylvania battle, Grant had ordered Sheridan's cavalry to ride to the right to Lee's rear, while Butler and the Army of the James would come from the south. Sheridan was met by Jeb Stuart, who defeated him, but at the cost of his own life. In Shenandoah, Sigel had failed in his assignment, being defeated by a lesser force commanded by Major General Breckinridge, who then sent his 2,500 men to Lee at Cold Harbor. Reinforcements. Moved his reinforcements to 36,000 from the James River, tentatively allowing Beauregard to bring reinforcements up from North Carolina to Drury's Bluff. And on May 16th, Beauregard drove Butler to the Bermuda Hundred. Richmond was for now safe, and Davis sent additional reinforcements to Lee at Cold Harbor. Lee now had 10,000 more men than Grant had known. The battle would commence on June 1st, and in the evening, the Union Sixth Corps and also the 18th Corps arrived and assaulted the Confederate works to the west of the crossroads with some success. On June 2nd, the remainder of both armies arrived, and the Confederates built an elaborate series of fortifications, 7 miles long. On June 3rd, at dawn, 3 Union corps attacked the Confederate works on the southern end of the lines and were easily repulsed, but with heavy casualties. Attempts the assault on the northern end of the line and resumed, and the assaults on the southern lines were unsuccessful. Grant said of the battle in his memoirs, "I've always regretted that last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made. No advantage whatever was gained to compensate for the heavy loss we sustained." The armies confronted each other along these lines until the night of June 12th, when Grant again advanced to his left flank, marching to the James River. The aftermath. The Union suffered 13,000 casualties, the Confederates only 2,500. To date, for the overland campaign, the Union suffered 55,000 casualties, the Confederates 32,000. Lee was able to anticipate Grant's every move, and the strategy of attrition was working against Robert E. Lee. Grant was being called the Butcher by Mary Todd Lincoln. Some said that his initials U.S. meant for unspeakable slaughter, Grant. The battle and siege of Petersburg. Grant moved within 20 miles south of Richmond to Petersburg. In an initial 4-day battle in June of 1864, Grant lost another 8,000 men and then dug in for a 9-month siege, the longest of the war. Petersburg would almost be similar to the kind of fighting because it would be trench warfare that the world would not see until the First World War. Despite all this, in the midst of the Civil War, the United States held a presidential election. The Democrats would nominate George McClellan. They believed it was ideal to oppose Lincoln in the 1864 election. Lincoln was sure he was going to lose, that since McClellan was very well loved by his troops, the troops would vote for him. With heavy casualties in the east and stalemate outside Petersburg in the city of Atlanta, Lincoln thought he was done. The Battle of Atlanta. With 100,000 men, William Tecumseh Sherman left Chattanooga, Tennessee, in May of 1864 to invade Georgia, facing Confederate State General Joseph E. Johnston with 60,000 men. Initially, he was repulsed by Johnson, and by the 17th of July, the Union Army had crossed into Georgia, 8 miles from Atlanta. Davis had grown impatient with Johnston and replaced him with John Bell Hood, who attacked Sherman twice before pulling back into Atlanta. Bell abandoned Atlanta on September 1st, leaving the city to Sherman on the next day. The fall of Atlanta lifted Northern morale, and staggered by Grant's heavy losses in the pursuit of Lee, would contribute to the Republicans' victory in November of 1864. What's also important about taking Atlanta is that was a mail railroad hub. How will Lee get resupplied? Sherman's march to the sea. Leaving Thomas to hold Hood and protect Tennessee, Sherman with 60,000 men will march to the Atlantic Ocean. Before leaving Atlanta, he confiscated or destroyed all useful equipment. Sherman cut a swath through Georgia 60 miles wide and 300 miles long. Sherman said he was going to make Georgia howl, and systematically destroyed factories, cotton gins, warehouses, bridges, railroads, and some public buildings. The same scorched earth policy used by Sheridan in Tennessee. His soldiers foraged liberally throughout the country, resulting in wild looting. Sherman's advance was virtually unopposed, advancing Savannah on the 10th of December, which fell on December 22nd. Savannah was not put to the torch, since his mayor rode out to meet Sherman to tell him the Confederate Army had left. Having good memories of being stationed in Savannah as a lieutenant, Sherman would not have the city destroyed. Sherman would then wire Abraham Lincoln and says, I present to you as a Christmas present the city of Savannah. The last days of the Confederacy. After the election of 1864, results were made public, and as Union forces increasingly gained control of large portions of the Confederate States, many Confederate leaders, including Confederate Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge, recognized that defeat was imminent and sought a negotiated peace and urged Lee to find an honorable way to end the war. The breakdown of transportation, the blockade, and the federal occupation of important producing areas and devastation of all others spread hunger throughout much of the South. Riots and demonstrations against the Confederate States of America broke out in several southern cities. Because of increasing desertions in the Confederate Army, Confederate President Jefferson Davis refused to admit defeat and urged the Confederate troops to begin a guerrilla war. On March 13, 1865, he signed a bill calling for slaves to be recruited to join the Army with their owners' permission. When the war ended, however, before these potential recruits could enlist. Carolina burns. Lincoln at last had found a general who was not afraid to pursue Lee, and on March 9th he elevated Grant to the chief of the armies of the United States. While Grant pursued Lee, William Tecumseh Sherman and Schofield led 100,000 forces into Georgia. As we've already seen, the march from 5th to July of 1865, Sherman then fanned north through South Carolina, telling his troops, we're heading to South Carolina, bring your matches, wreaking even a greater havoc than in Georgia. Over 12 towns, including Columbia, the capital, were burned. Sherman would say, this is where secession began, and by damn, this is where it's going to end. The fall of Columbia led to the evacuation of Charlestown, which fell to the Union. Sherman ordered 2 all-black regiments to lead the Union forces as they entered Charlestown after its surrender. In a show of honor, Union General Robert Anderson, who had been forced to surrender Fort Sumter early in the war, was asked to raise the U.S. flag over the fort on April 15, 1865. Sherman's advance through North Carolina was slowed by Confederate General Johnston, but restored by Lee, now commanding all Confederate forces. At the Battle of Bentonville was the last time Sherman would meet Johnston and defeat him. The Hamptons Road Conference. Jefferson Davis sent Vice President Alexander Stephens, R.M.T. Hunter, and J. Campbell to confer with Lincoln and Secretary of War Seward across the Union transport the River Queen. Stephens seemed like a logical choice. Stephens had known Lincoln since they were both congressmen, and they were actually very good friends. But Davis's insistence that the Confederacy be recognized was unacceptable to Abraham Lincoln during the conference. Petersburg and Richmond abandoned. On March 25th, Robert E. Lee, with the 54,000 troops, could not break through Grant's besieging army, an advantage with 115,000 at Fort Stedman, east of Petersburg, but was badly beaten instead by Grant, who systematically battered the Confederate lines. On April 1st, Lee made his last assault of the war at Five Forks near Petersburg, but was repelled by the arrival of Philip Sheridan. On April 2nd, Lee evacuated Petersburg and Richmond and headed towards Lynchburg, where he hoped to join forces with Johnston. Surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, 9 April 1865. With Grant in pursuit of Lee, Sheridan prevented Lee from moving by rail towards Johnston, virtually surrounding the Confederates. Lee's forces were now less than 30,000, had very few rations. Grant's aide said, if the thing is pressed, the thing will surrender. On April 7th, Grant requested Lee to surrender, and Lee asked for terms. Grant, who had a terrific headache, said that it immediately went away. Lee would meet Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in the home of Wilmer McLean. McLean had previously lived at Manassas, where his house was the headquarters for Beauregard in the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861. After the battle, McLean wanted to move his family as far away from war as possible and moved to Appomattox Courthouse. McLean could rightfully say, "The war began in my backyard and ended in my front parlor." Lee had arrived first and waited for 30 minutes before Grant arrived. Grant arrived, apologized for being late, and tried to make small talk, saying he remembered Lee from the Mexican War, but Lee did not remember Grant when he was a lieutenant. Then Lee reminded General Grant the purpose of their meeting. They would quickly come to terms. Lee's soldiers were paroled and were allowed to return home. Their officers were permitted to retain their sidearms. All soldiers could retain their private horses and mules because it was planting season. All equipment was to be surrendered. 25,000 rations were going to be issued by the Union Army to the Confederates. When Lee stepped out, there was a big hurrah by the Union soldiers, but Grant hushed them and told them the Southerners are our countrymen again. Lincoln's last days. Federal troops reoccupied Richmond, and immediately Lincoln visited Richmond on April 4th, and he sat in Jefferson Davis's chair in the Confederate White House. According to Ward Hill Layman, Lincoln's friend and biographer, Lincoln discussed with Layman and others a dream he had, saying, "Who is dead in the White House? I demand." One of the soldiers, "The President," was his answer. "He was killed by an assassin." Then came a loud burst of grief from the crowd, which woke me up from my dream. I slept no more that night, although it was only a dream, and I have been strangely annoyed by it ever since. Lincoln would give his last address on April 11th after he returned from Richmond, and he stood at the White House window. He talked about the problems of Reconstruction. "It is fraught with great difficulty, nor is it a small additional embarrassment that we, the loyal people, differ among ourselves as to the mode, manner, and means." He defended his own plan for Reconstruction, admitting that the Louisiana Constitution was not perfect, but willing to modify his plan if it turned out to be adverse to the public interest. A transformational war. Not only did the Civil War result in the preservation of the Union, the federal government's power and the seas expanded during the war. The Civil War was the first modern war in many ways, from the introduction of armored ships to that of rifled cannon. The war set the stage for future world wars. Signs and scholars point to indicating that this was a modern war included the use of railroads and steamboats for faster transportation, even the use of the telegraph. The scale and scope of the war, geographically, and the size of the militaries, and the types of military technological advancements that were made available. The 13th Amendment would make slavery illegal in the United States when it was ratified on December 18, 1865. The word slavery appeared for the first time in the Constitution. The debate today still continues why the North won the war. Some historians have focused on the weakness of the Confederacy, the lack of industry and railroads, and the tension between the states and the central government, killed by states' rights. Richmond had a poor political leadership under Davis, faulty coordination and communication. Robert E. Lee probably gives the best explanation when he said, "After 4 years of tourist service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia had been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources." General George Pickett, his famous charge at Gettysburg, would say, "I always thought the Yankees had something to do with it." Historian Shelby Foote would claim that the North really fought this war with one arm tied behind its back, due to the amount of industry and the numbers that they used to fight the war. Later on, Sherman would actually have accept the surrender of Johnston. and given even more terms. Jefferson Davis would be captured somewhere in Georgia, and the war was over.